Up next, we're going to discuss the possible tax ratification election. Dr. Dupree?
Yes, sir. So you'll recall last week's workshop, we had an extended conversation about the staff's recommendation to conduct a TRE. During that meeting, the board asked a number of questions and for follow-up information, and we thought it would be beneficial to go ahead and put that on the agenda this evening for a further conversation. I want to point out, because you did have some questions about this, that there are 3 actions on the consent agenda this evening, as we discussed last week. 2 of them have to do with the proposed tax rates. The other has to do with the public hearing that we conduct each year. So I do want to clarify that the action tonight is simply to declare the proposed tax rates. You are not adopting a tax rate. You are not calling a TRE this evening. You're just scheduling the meeting to have the extended conversation and to conduct the public hearing on the matter, at which we would also have public comment in response to any recommendation that the board would be considering that evening. So tonight's agenda items are not binding, other than to put public notice to the community that this is what the board is considering. So I just wanted to be very clear about that. What's very different about this year's process, because you all have been doing this for quite a few years together now, but what is very different about this process, though, is typically you'll do the hearing in June and then adopt the budget in June, and then you come back in September and adopt the tax rate. This year, however, and this is a big if, because we're not making any assumptions at this point, if you choose to follow our recommendation and call the TRE on June the 3rd, you would be adopting the tax rate before you adopt the budget. So that's one of the requirements of the TRE, and that's different than what we usually do. So on the 3rd, we would be asking you to do the public hearing from 5:30 to 6:30, and then in a called meeting to begin at 6:30, then we would ask you to consider adopting the tax rate as proposed, and then you would come back 2 weeks later and actually adopt the budget. Now, there's a number of questions we're going to get into this evening, but I want you to know there's 2 big ifs at this point that are really embedded in all of this. And one of the first ifs is if we call a TRE. At this point, as I mentioned, there's no assumption that will happen. We're simply presenting the recommendation. And then the other question is, if you do call the TRE, how many pennies will it be for? And so that we wanted to provide the conversation this evening. So Steve has got a number of slides that really directly address your questions that you asked last week and then that you sent to me during the past week. So I'll turn it over to Steve to kind of get into some of those nuts and bolts.
Thank you, sir. Members of the board. So I want to try to get busy with this. So why do we need a TRE? Basically, we want to try to make sure that we can cover raises for our teachers and classroom staff. We have formula changes that we have to deal with, and we want to be able to make sure we can fund our district goals and objectives. So I got slides for all 3 of these. A mandatory increase is part of the bill, and so there is going to be a mandatory increase. Whether or not it's 5,000 or what, we still don't know. They're going back and forth in the Conference Committee. So we're going to have to address that in one way or the other. But right now, they're only talking about teachers and not counselors, not nurses, not classroom aides, or even any of the other positions that directly impact instruction. Also, some of the districts around us may get as much as $20,000 more per teacher in the funding, depending on what the final bill is. And so that allows them the opportunity to give significant increases, make more investments than we would be able to. And obviously, but it's important to point out, and it's obvious, but we got to say it, the well-compensated staff directly, and our ability to compensate well helps us with retaining and recruiting, and then it also obviously impacts the quality of instruction. Okay?
I'd like to tie on to that because when I talk to teachers and hear from teachers about that, they do remind me that it's not just compensation, that it is overall experience in development and the classroom support they receive. And so I want to tie this together a little bit, and I'm not going to interject every time, but I thought because when you mention other districts, neighboring districts could get up to $20,000 per student, that would enable them to put some of that money into teacher pay. but it also allows them to maintain very much lower class sizes, have resources to address behavior, special education, by additional resources that we would not be able to provide. And for us, we're going to get through that in a minute, but I wanted to make the connection on this slide that is much more than just teacher compensation. There's many other investments that make a teacher's life manageable and much more effective and successful by having those resource investments made on their behalf.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So what does the funding formula have to do with this? So we've spoken about some of the changes to the funding formula, and some are worse for us in other districts. So in particular, the elimination of the CEI, how that impacts us. The reductions in recapture help other districts. They don't help our district because we haven't been in recapture. The increasing in waste for poverty, that does help, as it helps all districts, but some districts have double the amount of students that we have in poverty. Remember this picture that we showed you before in terms of the funding. The light blue and the dark blue are the districts, including us, that are on the lower end of the revenue per student. And you can see that those districts, by and large, are more suburban districts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the suburban districts, by and large, are kind of on the downside of this. Also, it's important to point out that the pre-K, having it mandatory as part of the upcoming bills, the only incremental revenue that we're going to be able to expect from that is the half-day funding. The early education allotment is already built into the revenue formulas, and I don't see us getting incremental revenue beyond that. And I don't think that's going to be enough to cover everything that we have. And we can talk about more in the future. But I do see that gap as being up to $7.6 million. So basically, it'll be an unfunded mandate, depending on the final bill and how everything shakes out. So we need to make sure that we are able to address our district goals and objectives. So we've spoken about a lot of these, and Dr. Dupree touched on these. But we definitely expect the identification of SPED to grow. We have grown by 64% in just 2 years' time, okay, in the number of students that have been identified, and that's only going to continue to go up. Tier 3 behavior and trauma-informed care, that's one of the things Dr. Bree was just really speaking about right now. There's been a major increase in that in district and region-wide, and the teachers are really just crying for help. I mean, it is essential that we give them the help they need because it's a major point of classroom management. We want to make sure we can provide equitable access to curriculum. We would be expanding the instructional coach model from 26 campuses to go to district-wide within a couple years, so we're going to need more funding for that. And then also GT support expansion. You can see that that's on the list as well. So there's a lot of investments that we need to achieve our goals and objectives. So do we have to take all 11 pennies? Well, the short answer is no. We don't have to take all 11 pennies, okay? Having 11 initially as part of current law just gives us more flexibility. What we don't know is that we're going to have to put together something for our legislative constituents to advocate for us with regard to an amendment to House Bill 3, and it's in Commerce Committee now. Remember when we were talking about our day at the Capitol, and then subsequent to that, how we went back and visited, and we were panicking about whether or not we're going to even be able to do a TRE. Well, right now, the language won't allow us to do one this year. Now, if we call one before it's signed, that's another matter. But we've been assured by some of our representatives that they will adjust the final language to allow us to do a TRE this year. But one thing that we want to make sure, and I've seen this in some of the conservative rhetoric, is that if you do get to authorize an amount, let's say $1.17, and that's voted, they do want to be able to give you the flexibility to not necessarily take all those pennies at one time. Okay, right now, current law says that if you went up to 114, for example, you'd have to have an election again to get those next 3 pennies. And that's just an inefficient use of taxpayer resources. I do think they want to give districts flexibility so that they don't necessarily have to grab all those pennies at one time through an election. But an amendment will be needed for that, and we will be working on sending something to our representatives this week because they are in the middle of conference committee. So what are the alternatives to taking all 11? Well, we could take a portion of them. We could take, 5 or 6. I mean, I'm going to show you the numbers on what it would mean for a taxpayer if we did 5.5, for example, just splitting it in the middle. But if we did that, so the board action would be needed need to be taken in September to actually adopt a different rate than what we'd be talking about in June, okay? But then we do feel like we'd have a more long-term risk of our ability to achieve goals and objectives by not getting all of the pennies, okay? Now, if we maintain the existing tax rate, and that's certainly an alternative to not do anything, after 2019-20, we do feel like our classroom ratios could be at risk because of the additional expending we're going to have to do in SPED. And then after 1920, because again, we have a good budget for 1920 based on current law with a 2% placeholder for compensation. But we do think that some of the existing programs over time we would need to dismantle them in order to maintain the regular program and the special education. And then we would have a lot of difficulty addressing compensation in the out years. And so I mentioned the suburban districts before in that one slide, and I really feel like the way that the legislation written right now, it's setting up the suburban districts to fail, okay? Because without a TRE, we would be in the position to have potentially a lot of bad things happen. If you don't get a TRE, if you have to go through that process, you're gonna really struggle. And so we are in competition with the charters. The war over students between charters and urban districts, that's kind of over. I mean, the urbans aren't doing very well, and they've reached critical mass on the charters in the urban districts, okay? The new front, okay, to use a military term, is in suburban districts. And you could definitely make the case that the legislature knows what they're doing in this regard. And so we really feel like this is essential to us in terms of being able to compete with the charters that are around us. So why call one now versus waiting until 2020? So if we do something in 2019, we'll have revenue certainty much earlier. We could address compensation sooner. And we also have the option in 19 whether or not we would do one in August or November. In 2020, November would be the only option. Efficiency audit, we would definitely have to have an efficiency audit in 2020. I think one of the key points is with regard to tax rate compression. There is going to be some tax rate compression in the bills. Both the Senate version and the House version have a reduction of the tax rate embedded, and it is easier to increase your tax rate at the same time that it's going down because you're actually asking for fewer pennies in the long run. Now, what that compression is going to be was still to be determined based on the Conference Committee. One version has 4 pennies, another version has 6 pennies. So we did just have an election, so having one right afterwards, okay, that's tough. But if we do wait a year, it'll be just a year before the next election. So that's kind of a push either way. If we do something this year, it could definitely be viewed as proactive reaction to poor legislative results, and we can certainly document that and communicate that. But if we go out in 2020, we're probably less likely to attract outside groups because there would be more districts having a TRE in 2020. If we did something in 2019, and especially if we did one in August, we'd likely to be the only one. And we would have a significant communication challenge because, again, the legislature is talking about how they're putting $9 billion into public education, but we know that the bulk of that's going to property tax relief, and because of the loss of the CEI, we're not really benefiting from it. How many districts have held TREs? So 72% of the districts throughout the state have done this. I've been trying to put this off as long as possible, but the CEI is really what's kind of putting us over the edge for this. 593 districts have had a ratified TRE that has been successful. So what is the estimated increase for our average taxpayer? Our average home value is expected to be $261,000. And so if the full 11 pennies on an annual basis equates to $287. If we asked for half of that with 5.5 pennies, that annual amount for our average taxpayer would be $144. So why do we have a 90-day fund balance? Well, it is an industry best practice, and our fiscal strategies, it's not actually in board policy, but it's in the fiscal policy that the board approves and reviews every August. The 90-day requirement is based on having the 60 days of fund balance that we need at the beginning of the fiscal year for our timing of property tax payments, but also it has that additional month that we have for the potential loss of state revenue. So why is potential loss of state revenue, why is that relevant now when we're talking about this much money going into the system? Well, really, it's about how it's going into the system. Final legislation is going to include compression of the tax rate, or value caps, or an increase in homestead exemption, or all three. And all of those will require recurring additional state funding. I mean, ongoing. They're going to have to make this up over time. And we know that there are times that history repeats itself. Excess compression in 2006 combined with the national recession did lead to massive state cuts in 2011. And we're hoping that doesn't happen again, but that was predicted by Carol Keaton Strayhorn in a letter she wrote to Governor Abbott. I could share that with you. I saw a copy of it, and it was just amazing how much of what she wrote in 2006 came to pass just a few years later. And you can see one of our hashtags there. I won't get into it there, but we do anticipate using that if we get into marketing mode. So what are the benefits of having the 90 days? There's a lot of good things here, but one of the things I want to make sure I point out, it helps us put off debt issuance. I mean, we use that money. We don't just issue commercial paper right away. We actually use the general fund to pay a lot of our construction bills, and then we get to a point, then we'll issue commercial paper. We also use the general fund to cover most of the costs of the Malala Elementary 51 elementary school through the reimbursement resolution, and we were able to do that because of the fund balance that we had. You can see also it impacts our ratings, which impacts our debt costs. And then also, when we had a great example of this, with Hurricane Harvey, we didn't have to wait for insurance proceeds or FEMA proceeds to act quickly to make the fixes needed. We had the cash reserves to be able to do that because of our fund balance. So if we did reduce the fund balance, fund balance is best used for one-time expenditures. But if we did use it for recurring expenditures, this is just a graph of how you could have a potential drawdown of $60 million over time, but that would need to be made up if you're funding recurring expenses. Eventually, you would have to have an additional source. And so the problem is that if we did this, let's say we took $20 million each year over 3 years, and we could fund a lot of the things that we want, but they're all recurring expenses. If we have a TRE after that, but then let's say we aren't successful with the TRE at that time, then we could be in a situation where we may have to cut $40 to $60 million in a year, which would be incredibly difficult. It was hard enough to make the cuts that were made in 2011, but one of the benefits, or one of the things that made that easier, is that every district was going through that. There was the narrative throughout the state. If we do use fund balance for recurring things over time, and we're the only district doing that, we could be in a jam where it's really just about our district, and we're not in the same boat as the other districts around us. We also do know that if we had a drawdown like this, we would expect a decline in our bond rating, and then our first score would negatively impact it. In 1 year, we wouldn't be able to be above the level of B in the first score. So if we showed you a 3-year budget outlook last time, but it didn't have compensation added. We just had the 2% in 1920. And so if you did have increases in the out years, and this includes increases of 3% in years 21, 22, and 23, you could see how we really dipped into the fund balance pretty quickly because those are all recurring expenditures. So if we did the TRE with under the current law, and again, I'm expecting with House Bill 3 the value of the TRE to be higher, but under current law there is some recapture. The operating revenues are going to be in the mid-30s there. We do think that we'd be able to address a lot of things we've been talking about here, as well as impacting pay. This, as far as pay is concerned, has a 4% increase in 1920, and then 2% every year after that. What would the budget look like? So we had this question last time we met. So you know how the board is asked to adopt a budget on a per function basis, and so the function codes 11, 12, and 13, they're in that first line instruction. That includes instruction, it includes library and media, it includes curriculum development, and so we've broken out the other functions by larger group below that. But so what we're going to show, what we're going to give you, we're going to ask you to adopt the proposed budget on the right, but you're going to see a document that shows what the budget would be under current law, supported by $1.06, and then the column in between, what the 11 pennies would do on a per function basis, and then you add those together for the budget at $1.17. And just a reminder for the board, the 32.9 million, anything that we would do to spend any of that would be coming to you in subsequent agenda items. For example, additional compensation would have its own agenda item. Then whatever we would do to address the other things in terms of adding more staff would have subsequent agenda items. So getting close to the end here, our ability, the need for the TRE depends on that final bill language. I talked about the amendments. The comp ed allotment, again, how they're going to be paying us for the children of poverty, there's still a lot of uncertainty on that because they're going to be changing it to census tracts versus just free and reduced qualification. What the final mandatory salary requirement is going to be, how the hold harmless or transitory funding is interpreted. We do expect some one-time relief from Harvey property value, but that's one time. I've asked for estimates on what that is. I don't expect to hear anything from TEA. I heard back from them. They said we're not going to release anything until mid to late June, so we have to wait for that. And then also how much the golden pennies are going to be worth and how many golden pennies they're going to be are still to be determined. And we're not expecting clarity on these things before we're asking you to call this election. And so, I don't know what else to say besides that. So our conclusions under current law and the collection rate, we do think that we'd only have limited funding to add new resources and to support the goals and objectives. We've talked about what's being funded, including what we're asking you to approve later today with some of the staffing requests that could be funded with the budget under current law. We think that calling the TRE would ensure us a lot of flexibility going forward. And then, we talked about some of the benefits there, sufficient funds for our goals and objectives, compensation, and then also in the future, if we really do put ourselves in a situation where there is a loss of state revenue, we think, we'd definitely be able to handle that given the case. So the time frame on what we expect. So we're talking about in June to have the public hearing and the vote on the budget, and then we have the final amendment. We would receive certified values in July, August, and during that time, we would be working hard to educate our stakeholders on the TRE purpose and the legislative outcomes. And we'd actually conduct the TRE at the end of August, and then September, we'd finalize a plan for the potential tax rate adjustment. So we would, if we would come down off the 117, we'd have an amendment for that, and then we would amend the budget as needed. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett. Mrs. James?
All right, I'm about 2 pages back in absorbing the information, so forgive me if I'm asking a question that you just spoke to. I have a few.
It's a lot of, that's all right, there's a lot of ground to cover.
There's a lot of ground. Okay, so my first question is, and I think maybe this was addressed on that last slide. So thank you for your clarification on when we would call for the TRE, we would adopt a tax rate at that time. Then can we change the can we reconsider the tax rate in September? And I think that's
yes,
what
for
you're
sure.
saying. So if the TRE passes, we can say, okay, thank you, and this is what we will tax this much this year.
Yes, it's our hope that, especially if we're able to have a positive impact on the amendments that go into the final version of House Bill 3, that we'd be able to have that flexibility to stair-step into that final number. And if that's the case, we would definitely communicate that during our campaign, for the TRE.
Okay, well, I like that idea, because when we look at the 11 cents plus the debt service of 2 cents, that adds to 13 cents, which is a 10% increase over what we have right now. And to me, that's too big of a chunk all at once. So I feel uncomfortable with that. But I like the idea of stair-stepping into something. And the other reason I like that is because I would really want to understand the strategic milestones we were trying to meet by investing this money, so that we can monitor the progress and show the community how we're how we're using their money and how this particular TRE impacted the district. So that would be important to me. I have another question on slide 8. One of the things you listed there was the efficiency audit, and one of our speakers brought that up tonight. What is an efficiency audit, and can you tell us about that?
We don't know for sure what the efficiency audit would look like. I have some ideas on what I think it could be, but a lot of the work that Gibson does, for example, for us in terms of the operational audits that are done, I don't know if it would be that extensive, but we get a lot of great information, from those. I suspect, just depending on the final language and the expectations, I think it's going to be more ratio analysis and how, like, for example, how does your spending in Function 41 compare to other districts and those kinds of things, all right? And so we've talked a lot about ours, and we showed, if we do this election, for example, we showed you that our ratio for that would be 2.6%. That was in one of the slides I just showed you. And, for a district our size, I mean, that's a pretty good number. But even you can make the case that there are some districts that are even less than that. But we know that we spend more on communications because of our communication needs in the district. We spend more on leadership development, for example. And so how all of that would come out in the efficiency audit, and what it would look like just really remains to be seen.
Okay, so what that's going to look like is kind of speculation at this point.
Yes, ma'am.
And if there's some certain cutoffs or some certain whatever that would be required to qualify you to have a TRE, that's all still up in the air. And
It's still up in the air. One thing's for sure, though, an efficiency audit wouldn't be free.
Yeah, well, I don't think the state's going to pay for it if they're going to require it. They're pretty consistent about that. Okay, well, that's so that's interesting, and I think, as we've kind of even talked about tonight, the Internal Audit Committee is constantly looking for ways to make our organization more efficient in every area. So just at face value, I'm not sure what an efficiency audit, what value that would be to us, I guess. But I guess we have to wait and see what it involves. The other thing I'd like to speak to that you brought up is the 90-day fund balance, and should we have that? What and all the question around, is that required? So my opinion on this is not a question; it's a comment for the benefit of my teammates. I feel we should have a 90-day fund balance. I feel it's important to our bond rating, as you described. I like the idea of having reserves for emergencies like Harvey or other calamities, tornadoes, anything we might have in the district. And I do think using it for an ongoing expense is not wise. It should be for one-time expenditures only. So I agree with your comments along those lines. And then my last question is, in the budget that flashed by, did these compensation increases, and I think on the other first one, or either one, I guess they're the same or similar, did they include across the board compensation for all the staff, nurses, librarians, counselors, aides, things like that, or was it just particularly targeted? Because I believe the House bill legislation or the Senate bill is targeting certain groups of employees and not others. Yeah,
the Senate is targeting just the teachers and the librarians. What we have in this 3-year budget outlook with the TRE is a 4% placeholder for all staff, okay, in 1920, and 2% in the future years. For all staff.
4% the first year, this
Yes.
current year, and then 2% in the
in
next
the other
3.
years.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rice?
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. I just wanted to make a few comments. Thank you, Mr. Bassett. It's a very complicated subject, but going back to Carol Keaton Strayhorn, One Tough Grandma, when she made her comments back in 2005, time has proven she had a pretty good crystal ball back then. And in 2010, this school district had a $28 million shortfall from the state. And people would ask me if we could have a bake sale or a car wash to help make up the difference. And I would say, yes, we can. But to put it in perspective, if we turned off the lights and air conditioning in every facility we had at the time for a full year, we would still be $13 million short. And in short, a $28 million shortfall is catastrophic. And in a budget where 86% of the budget are for salaries and benefits, the only thing you can do is to cut staff, which is what we had to do. So we have to keep that in mind. And I agree with Mrs. James on the need for a 90-day fund balance, because the state, in their zeal to compress property tax growth, is giving up a reliable and a predictable revenue stream, namely local property tax growth. And what are they replacing it with? Is it a new sales tax, a penny sales tax? No, it's not. That's off the table now. And instead, they're going to rely on a good economy and oil and gas production. And the comptroller has cautioned against that very thing. So while the state has some money to play with this legislative session, there is certainly no guarantee that they will have this kind of money in the next legislative session. And I'm not very optimistic about it. So maintaining the 90-day fund balance is essential. Second, I know you based this budget on the current funding formula, which I would like everyone to remember is in play. It's being revised, and the way it stands now, will lose money. We will lose money. We're one of 16 districts out of 1,000 that will lose money. And as Mrs. Tossan mentioned last week, when she brought that up to the chair of the House Public Education Committee, said, well, you just need to have a TRE. So not a lot of sympathy. And arguably, they have a tough job coming up with a school funding formula for 1,000 districts that range in size from one of the 10th in the top 10 in the nation to 100 kids. We need more money for special education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was created in 1964 by Congress, who vowed to fund it at 40%, and they have failed to do it even one time over the last 55 years. And who makes up the slack? The individual school districts do. And last year, no less a person than Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, reprimanded the state of Texas on our special education spending. And I believe the state is going to have to pay about a $216 million fine to the federal government. And what was the legislature's response? They placed all the blame on 1,000 school districts across the state. So we have to we've got to take the hit, and we have to make up the difference for that. Charter schools. Now, my history is a little fuzzy, Mr. Bassett, but it seems like the United States fought a war with Great Britain about taxation without representation. So Mr. Rosenthal and I there were 3 seats open for publicly elected trustees, and if the public does not like the job we're doing, they can vote us out of office. But do charter schools have publicly elected trustees? They're appointed. Do they have an efficiency audit? Has the state conferred upon them the requirement to do any internal auditing whatsoever? I mean, I heard of a charter school the other day that bought a $450,000 condo in Houston to serve as their back of office for their computer system, and also to store records on students. And when questioned why they did that instead of just getting a warehouse somewhere, they really couldn't answer that question very, very well. So the other thing that we're dealing with here is coming up with a budget that is going to meet the needs of our very diverse school district population, and the fact that the number of children who qualify for free and reduced lunch in this district has increased to 45%. Our special education needs funding is increasing, and we cannot let that be an excuse for poor student performance. Whatever our students' needs are, we have to meet those needs. We have to overcome the negative effects of poverty in providing a quality education to assure student success and student outcomes. So, as I understand it, voting for the TRE on June 3rd puts into play our ability to conduct the election in August, and maybe by then the legislature will have finished its work and we'll be better able to know where we need to be. So I would just like to, I wanted to make those comments and to commend you for your work and your staff's work, who's doing a yeoman's job trying to create a budget and watch what the legislature is doing with the funding formulas at the same time, which may make you go crazy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Next, I'm gonna let Mr. Dave Rosenthal speak.
Thank you, President. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. So, Grell and Jim both had said what I was intending to say, but I wanted to thank you, Mr. Bassett, for most of those questions that I sent in, or that were sent in during the week, were probably mine about fund balance, because I was just trying to think, outside the box a little bit, and just trying to avoid, an 11-cent tax increase. So, but you're right. I mean, it is, and as Grell rightly pointed out, it's a one-time use, and once you use it, it doesn't regenerate. So, at least not very quickly. So I wanted to touch on just to reiterate a couple things. You had talked about and others had talked about the efficiency audit. We do have scores from the comptroller's office and whatnot, and our first scores, and those that, while they're not audits, as you correctly point out, they do show that we use our money pretty efficiently, and so I think as Mr. Rice may have pointed out, the risk in that efficiency audit is we really don't know what it's going to be in there, and also it really it's going to be what the legislature values, not what Fort Bend ISD the community values. So, for example, they value STAR scores. Okay, we kind of value student ownership of learning and leadership, and so there's a mismatch. So we don't get to choose that, unfortunately. So that's kind of a wild card. So that's one of the reasons that I feel like we should try to go forward with this sooner than later. And the other thing I just want to clarify is the tax compression. So both those bills have some sort of tax compression in there. And yes, they've increased the basic allotment, but with that tax compression, as I think Mr. Rice said, we will lose money. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on how things are interpreted, but they are going to decrease the compression. And the allotment went up. They're going to make adjustments in the formulas so that that local share number is going to be adjusted to make up for that difference. And so I do think that we'll be made whole from the tax rate compression, at least initially. My concern is whether or not the state will be able to afford to do that every year for the next several years. And so, given one of the things that they're working on, they put aside the idea to do the sales taxes. They are going to be look to rely on some of the oil and gas revenues, which have way more volatility. That could be potentially problematic, but we are thinking we're going to be made whole initially. It's the long-term concern on the tax rate compression.
And I guess if you combine that with the cap on property values, have we actually been able to, kind of figure that into it as well? Because I had a hard time seeing how we'd be made whole on that, on the combination of the two. So,
Right.
and anyway, so the other thing that you had talked about, Ms. Grail had brought up, Ms. James had brought up, that compensation and equity adjustments. That was, I think, on the last meeting. That was a number of like $9.8 million. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's additional 2% above and beyond what we're already planning to have as a placeholder for 1920. So that's why we'd be looking at 4% in the 1920 year if we did the TRE.
Okay, got it. All right, well, thank you all. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. Hilliger?
Quickly, so I definitely agree with my colleagues. I just have a question of how, so I know in the past you have definitely prevented us from doing a TRE, and in 5 years I've been on here, that's something that you could definitely put your hat on with preventing us from doing a TRE. If for whatever reason, I'm just looking at the what ifs, if we go to do a TRE and it doesn't pass, is that something that we could do again, go out for the next year? Is something that prohibits us from doing it within a certain period of time? What's the rules around that?
There isn't any bill language right now that prevents you from going out for a TRE the following year. Okay, so we'd be okay with that.
That's all. I think, I agree with some of your challenges that we're going to have with doing it in 2019, but we still have this very similar challenges in 2020 as well. So I just wanted to understand what the other side of the story would be if we didn't, if it didn't pass or we didn't go out for it. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ms. Hilliger. Mrs. Tolsan?
Yeah, that was a really good question because I'll just reiterate. I guess I'll round things out, or maybe Mr. Burdine will after I do. But I agree with the things that my colleagues have said. I think we have to keep the 90-day fund balance. There's a reason that we do that, and that is being fiscally conservative, much like the state's rainy day fund. We have to have our own rainy day fund, which we actually had to use for a rainy day not that long ago. So I think we need to keep it. So Mr. Rosenthal made my point is that I don't think, so they're supposed to do a hold harmless for the 2.5% cap. They're also supposed to do a hold harmless for the tax compression. I don't see it either. I don't see how and the Senate admitted that they did not know how much their bill was going to cost. They still don't know, and that's their version of the bill. So I don't think they're going to be able to pay for it, and I certainly don't think it's sustainable. And as you pointed out, the oil and gas revenues, our Comptroller Hagar has said, do not do that time and time again. So I said that last week. I just want to reiterate that because part of the challenge that we face, I said to somebody this past week, this job feels impossible sometimes because none of us want to sit up here and vote for an 11-penny increase in the tax rate. But if we don't do that, the challenges that we face are much, much greater. And I think, as I said last week, they have kids on the end of them. So I think that's what drives me. One of the things I just wanted to remind everyone on your slide 4, where you say that the changes to the funding formula, and you talk about the elimination of the CEI, reductions in recapture, and increase in weights for poverty. Every single one of these is really a negative hit to us in one fashion or another. So the CEI is the cost of education index, and universally they have said that's going to go away. And the whole point of the cost of education index is to, because in competitive markets like the one we're in, they gave us a little bit of a bump because we're not just competing with other school districts, we're competing with other industry. So we're trying to recruit teachers that other industries are, from the same work pool, employee pool that other industries are trying to recruit from. And it becomes very, very hard to be competitive in the Houston market where the job market is really good. I mean, fares pretty well. So when that CEI goes away for us, that is a big hit to begin with. And they're trying to make it up by giving more to the recaptured districts, which we are not, so we don't get that. And then they're trying to make it up by giving more, increasing the weights for children in poverty. And as you said, while that helps us some, we are not as high as other districts. So ultimately, with that and the unfunded mandates on top of it, like the mandatory teacher pay raises, and at a certain level, with no flexibility for us to make those decisions, and with the mandatory full-day pre-K, which that funding is already included in our pot, then I think we talked about at the end of the day, we're actually losing money, like Mr. Rice said. So that is what really concerns me, is that at the end of the day, we're not even complaining about getting more money. I think one of our legislators said that to us, because we're not getting more money. So at the end of the day, we're just not. I just wanted to put an exclamation point again on the special education problem, because that's another mandatory expense, because it is required by law. So a 64% increase in identified kids is gigantic. That is just gigantic. I've been working in this field for 19 years now, and that is just off the charts. And to expect us to have to make that up is, our kids are just gonna suffer if we don't find a way to take care of our revenue stream. And so I think we have to step up and do what maybe the legislature is struggling with on their end, is finding a sustainable revenue stream. And unfortunately, it means asking our taxpayers to put more in. But, it'll be their call at the end of the day. But I think I have to do my job and say, I'm at least going to ask you for it. So thank you. You guys have done a phenomenal job, by the way. So thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. So I agree with what everyone up here has said. I wanted to make a comment about the 90-day fund, and I know we've all talked about it, but I continue to hear about it in the community. Would I be accurate in saying that keeping that bond rating, our A++ bond rating, saves us tens of millions of dollars?
I don't know if it's tens of millions, but certainly over time, when you're doing $1 billion bond program, I would certainly say in the millions. Okay. But we haven't gotten any of the calculations on what we think what that impact would be. We do think that we will have that by the time we're out campaigning and such, but I don't know if I'd go quite that far to say tens of millions. But now, if you look at over the whole time that we've had that rating and that differential compared to other districts, yeah, you're probably up there.
And that's where I was coming from. Not necessarily the past bond, but the time that we've had that rating, it adds up to millions and millions of dollars. It's not several thousand. So I wanted to make that point. And then, as you had stated, the efficiency audit, we don't know what that looks like, but the audit that we received from Gibson is way more extensive than it would likely be from the state. So I just wanted to make that point as well. But anyhow, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for all the hard work, especially to your team. This is a lot. So once again, kids are tied to the end of this. So I can't thank you enough for your work. We will now convene an enclosed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act, Chapter 551, and those sections listed in the agenda, and for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney on any or all subject matters authorized by law. We are now convening closed session.